Okay. Well, I think we'll begin. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to this afternoon's CMEI event. If you haven't already done so, please can you sign the sheet so you get then put onto the CMEI list and get invited to all our exciting events. We've got another couple this semester, but there'll be some next year as well. So, my name's Helen Haste. If you didn't know, I'm one of the co-conveners of CMEI. I'm very pleased today to introduce Mark Tappan. I first met Mark about 30 years ago when he was a doctoral student here at the Ed School, and I was visiting from time to time the Centre for Moral Education. And it's lovely to have him back here as a visiting scholar this year. He's currently, and has been for some time, Professor of Education at Colby College in Maine. And I think he's enjoying his time here. So coming back to the Ed School again. And he and his wife, Lynn, have been doing a lot of exciting work on gender issues. And they co-authored a book with another colleague a few years ago called Packaging Boyhood.
Yeah.
Saving Our Sons from Superheroes, Slackers, and Other Media Stereotypes, which I think is a wonderful title. And he's going to talk today about his work on educating boys to become good and moral and ethical men. So I'm delighted you were able to join us and to present your work. So thank you very much. And we're going to discuss the commentary on Mark's paper after he's been treated by Reid Higginson, who is in P3 and has just completed to his pleasure his oral defence examinations. So he's allowed to move on to the next stage of his work. So well done, Reid. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Helen. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks to Reid for agreeing to do this. Yeah, it's been a wonderful time being back. As Helen said, I spent 10 years in this building on the 3rd floor and the 5th floor back in the 80s and early 90s, working with Larry Kohlberg and Carol Gilligan. So it's and meeting Lynn and all the good folks here. So it's been a great opportunity to be here. And just an interesting, the irony isn't lost on me that when I was here, I was among those who was really became clear to me and others that Larry Kohlberg's, for those of you who know Larry's work, Kohlberg's work that focused exclusively on boys and men was problematic as a basis for a theory of moral development broadly. But here I am now, sort of 30 years later, interested in boys and men. So I don't know what that all means, but it's an interesting connection. Anyway, so this is work in progress, absolutely. And so I welcome Reid's comments and other comments that you may have, questions. I really appreciate the opportunity to share this sort of in progress and then to learn from you all and expand my thinking. So as you all know, the concern, the worry, the anxiety about boys and men and the challenges and difficulties and vulnerability facing boys and young men these days is sort of everywhere you look. And there's been long-term concern about boys in crisis, boys in trouble, sort of the challenges that boys face in school, and from academic achievement to conduct problems, to health issues, and this is just a list of some of those challenges and concern that boys and young men face. And this sort of vulnerability-based perspective has really dominated the way we think about boys and men these days. I sort of think of it as all the bad news that's out there, and it's been valuable to really call attention to the crises and the challenges facing boys and young men. But it's also really perpetuated a kind of negative view, and it's sort of hard to have much hope. You can't, it continues today, right? So almost daily, opening up a paper or online, you see something more about the Decline of Man. This is a piece from Thomas Edsall in the New York Times. The health challenges facing man. This is from the Atlantic just recently. And some of you probably saw the Globe a couple weeks ago, the loneliness of men. So this sort of bad news continues. And certainly it was part of the conversation about the election, right? And the concern about, not only Trump as a kind of representative of toxic masculinity and, his, the way in which he seemed to represent a kind of tough, strong, sort of real man that somehow addressed the anxieties that many men are facing these days. So this is just kind of everywhere, and the bad news, it's sort of everywhere you look. In the world that I live and work in, the small college world, the university world, that's also this world. Michael Kimmel's Guyland, published in 2008, is a sort of represents an important sort of, in a way, very much an extension of this sort of bad news notion, but also a really important sense of kind of what's going on for young men in the ages sort of 16 to 26, the emerging adulthood era. Some of you know that work. So Kimmel's if you don't know Kimmel, he's the leading sociologist of gender and of masculinity, certainly, in the contemporary world. So he paints this portrait of what he calls Guyland as the social arena in which young men, and thinking primarily about men sort of leaving home, going off to college. So he's writing about a particular group of men, privileged folks going into higher education. They have to prove themselves as real men. They have to prove themselves to their peers. And this sort of rules and restrictions and messages about what constitutes a real man and how you have to exist in Guyland is pervasive in this context, Kimmel argues. He offers this sort of 10-point list of rules for guys, the Guy Code, which echoes William Pollock's Boy Code. Some of you know Pollock's work from the early 2000s around the messages that young boys get, and Kimmel says they get the same messages in a different form, and the same sort of strict rules you got to follow to be a real guy, a real man, to live up to the standards of what Robert Connell calls hegemonic masculinity, the kind of hyper-masculine image of the stereotypes. And there are these sort of three dimensions of Guyland that Kimmel notes: this culture of privilege and entitlement, the culture of silence, and the culture of protection that sort of perpetuate and again perpetuate and extend this culture. So, Guyland is very much, a representation of the patriarchy, and I think also absolutely represents this notion of kind of the worst of masculinity, or the so-called toxic masculinity, and it resonates again very much in my world of the young men that I've worked with and taught over the last 25 years at Colby, the 18 to 22-year-old kind of privileged group of young guys. And much of Guyland resonated very much with our work at Colby and my sense of that context. Just a note quickly before going on. So this is Kimmel's latest book, Angry White Men. Apparently he's working on another book on sort of men who are involved in extremist political movements, which would be interesting to your work. So Kimmel's definitely, made his name by perpetuating kind of the bad news, and it's kind of representing the challenges that men are facing these days. but also resonates in very significant ways to some of the political dimensions. So anyway, so back to Colby. So Guyland resonated at Colby. Kimmel, in fact, interviewed some Colby students as part of his project. But it didn't strike me as the whole story. And as I began teaching Guyland and talking to my students and working with my students on a number of projects around gender violence prevention and sort of building a group of young guys thinking about masculinity and critiquing masculinity, it just didn't, there seemed to be another story. And I sort of frame that as sort of the good news here, that in spite of all of, or in the midst of all of the bad news, there's some good news. And I certainly encountered and have continued to encounter a number of young men at Colby and elsewhere who, although they benefit from multiple forms of privilege, were really nevertheless committed to being better, kinder, more caring, more compassionate, committed to social justice, whether it's sexual violence prevention or battling racism, homophobia, et cetera, on campus. Interested in a kind of critical reflection on the patriarchy and its influence on their lives. So there was this group of young men who seemed to be really different. And there's no doubt it's really difficult to be a man these days, to be a good man. There's tremendous pressure to be otherwise. But it really began to be clear to me that there's much to be learned from young men who sort of resist those pressures or really, significantly push back, or trying to be good people and good citizens, again, to be caring, compassionate, just, fair, all of those things. So, and there's other evidence in the research literature about, there's sort of other good news, if you will. So, Carlos Santos, who's a student of Niobe Way at NYU, is now teaching and running his own lab at Arizona State. Did a study of these, almost 500 diverse middle school boys in the Northeast, and he was using, this is kind of survey study, but he was interested in distinguishing boys who seemed to kind of embrace the conventional norms of masculinity, being emotionally stoic, being tough, sort of stressing autonomy, and those who resisted those stereotypes. And he found interesting evidence to suggest that the boys who resisted these stereotypes, who didn't sort of endorse stoicism, toughness, autonomy, to the same degree that the folks who sort of adhered to them remained in more emotionally supportive relationships with their mothers and friends, scored lower on the childhood depression inventory, were more engaged in school. So hypermasculinity, again, seemed to be associated with negative outcomes on all those measures. And so Santos has done some other work. Niobe Way's book, Deep Secrets. Some of you may know Niobe's work on boys' friendships. And so there's evidence to suggest that resistance to the most significant kind of hypermasculine pressures, the pressures that Kimmel identifies as being central to Guyland, is healthy psychologically, physically, socially. And so that work is also really inspirational to my efforts here. So again, I don't want to say we should not look at the bad news, but there's also, there's really a value to look at the good news as well. So several years ago, I joined with this remarkable group of sort of undergraduate research assistants. And so we embarked on this project to explore and understand what, at that point, we were thinking about as sort of the development of forms of healthy masculinity. And the conversation about, the distinction between toxic masculinity and healthy masculinity is out there. And so we were thinking, all right, let's study the healthy side. Again, particularly among multiply privileged young men. And not all of our students at Colby enjoy multiple privileges, but many of them do, and so we have to acknowledge that, that's the kind of group that we're working with, but also there's a real value in understanding that kind of cohort and understanding how some of those folks can, adopt a different way of being. So we're interested in healthy masculinities, how families, schools, and communities can encourage, nurture, and support them. So we tried to explicitly take a strength-based approach, not a vulnerabilities approach. And that also connected to other work that I've done around promoting kind of healthy masculinities through the media literacy work in Packaging Boyhood. I've also been interested in boys' relationships with their teachers in schools, and that's also designed as a sort of a way to understand the positive dimensions of those relationships. So we figured the best way to begin this project was, or to undertake this project, was to talk to sort of exemplars, if you will, cisgender men who'd been identified as male at birth, who'd maintained that gender identity, who seemed to embrace and embody in their daily lives, again, kind of positive, productive, respectful ways of being. So we kind of reached out to faculty and administrators at Colby and coaches to identify, send us some names of guys. We sort of tried to come up with a broad definition of the kind of young man we were interested in talking to. We asked, folks on the research team kind of reached out to people they knew. And so we generated a list of subjects. It was a kind of snowball thing. We weren't trying to survey the whole population. We were really trying to identify the folks we really wanted to talk to. And we ended up with over 60 interviews. And when we started out, sort of our initial interview protocol, we asked them about, what does healthy masculinity mean to you? And many of them answered, not by describing, a healthy man, but really by describing, a good man or an ethical person. They used moral language that was familiar to me from work here around, the voices of justice, around fairness and respect and autonomy, the voices of care, around compassion, empathy, and love. So the ethical and engaged piece of this, or the moral dimension of this, it wasn't something I started out looking for, but in a really interesting way, it kind of came back around to my early interest in moral development. So, and maybe that's not a full surprise, but this didn't start out as a study of moral development or the moral development of men. Again, it started out as a study of healthy masculinity, and this is sort of the way in which we have come to define healthy masculinity. So, being ethical, trying to be ethical, being engaged in the world, trying to kind of do good work in one's relationships, in one's community is our definition. And we, so this became our kind of research question that guided Adrian Carmack and I in our work on sort of five thematic categories to capture the conditions, the experiences, the relationships, the contexts, the opportunities that seem to enable, again, these privileged young men to successfully navigate the challenges of being raised male in this culture, to resist these norms of kind of toxic hegemonic masculinity, and to at least embark on this journey towards being ethical and engaged. So these questions guided our sort of qualitative analysis of these interviews, trying to pull out these conditions that enabled resistance and sort of this positive approach. So I want to take you through briefly our 5 thematic categories, and then end with some thoughts about sort of implications for education and what we can do to nurture this. So that ultimately, again, that's our goal. It's to learn from these folks about what are the dimensions, what are the conditions that encourage this? So relationships, and again, I should say this isn't like, these will all be familiar to you. These are really, in many ways, kind of, not exactly generic developmental conditions, but they, these resonate with lots of other work. So, I think that's confirming in a certain sense, but they also take particular forms in the context of thinking about ethical and engaged forms of masculinity. So for the young men we talked to, the importance of relationships and opportunities to forge lasting connections and deep commitments to others throughout childhood, adolescence, and emerging adulthood represents what we think is the most important resource for developing and enacting ethical and engaged forms of masculinity and resisting the pressures to conform to the norms and dictates of patriarchal masculinity. So relationships, relational support, is really critical. Family support is one sort of dimension of this, support from parents, and that many of the young men we talked to, what they learned from their families, what they learned from their parents was, absolutely critical. Those messages, those, opportunities to live productive, healthy lives was critical. And so an example of how this sort of was not just though about masculinity, one of our subjects says, nothing was shaping as a masculinity thing, it was shaping as a sort of a good thing, suggesting, again, this wasn't so much messages about, you have to be a good boy or a good man, but it's about being a good person. Fathers came up a lot in our interviews as role models, both positive and, interesting enough, negative role models. So a number of our folks talked about how important their fathers were as positive role models and, fathers who they looked up to and who they learned so much from about being not only good, but being, a good man. But one of our subjects says, based off what my dad is, I know what a man isn't. It's like a negative. So, some had less positive relationships with their fathers, and that sort of negative role model was an important part of their experience. And then other mentors and role models emerged as key sort of relational players in the lives of the guys we talked to. And, one of our subjects says, the things my role models were doing weren't always about themselves. They were doing things for other people. I always strive to be like them. So recognizing the importance of mentors and role models. Ownership and control is the second category. For the men we talked to, experiencing ownership of their actions, their ethics, their values, their actions, and their identity, if you will, feeling in control, particularly when they were in situations in which resistance was called for, are critical conditions for the development of ethical and engaged forms of masculinity. And obviously, this is like a, this is a masculine stereotype in a certain sense, being in control. So we recognize that, and this is where the interesting interplay between kind of male privilege, if you will, and the dimensions of, the kind of stereotypical dimensions of masculinity that contribute to, the problematic things around power and control and sort of being at the center, comes into this in interesting ways. So ownership of values has to do with, again, ethical values and commitments. Again, we hear these framed in both in sort of the language of justice, the language of care, critically important to the folks we talk to. Ownership of actions is about responsibility, really taking responsibility for actions and their activities in the world. Actions like choosing not to drink or engage in other kinds of risky behaviors, making choices about how to treat women. That was sort of a big part of many of the conversations we had with young men. one of our subjects says, treating girls appropriately is huge in the very heteronormative kind of culture of Colby. That's an important ownership of actions and choices one makes. And then ownership of identity, or, I've thought about this previously. Lynn and I did some work on sort of authorship. Self-authorship is, maybe what's one way to think of this. This is sort of owning one's identity as one's gender identity as a man, male gender identity, but also, trying to be clear that those choices about what that means are my choices, not someone else's choices. So, one of our folks talked about their own versions of masculinity. You have to recognize who you are and be comfortable with who you are, says one of our young folks. And again, that's certainly a function of privilege, but it's also privilege sort of used in what seems to us to be a kind of healthy way. Certainly, just finally note the connection between identity and ethics, moral identity, moral action is a part of the ongoing conversation in the literature on moral development. So this is a place where this shows up in our data as well. So again, the classic developmental tension between challenge and support shows up here with opportunities or experiences of challenge and struggle as a key theme for many of our subjects. Not all of them, but many of the men we talked to had faced significant challenges, struggles, even trauma in their lives, and these experiences and conditions contributed in significant ways to their developing sense of themselves, and they seem to really connect in their own minds to their ability to resist, again, the hegemonic patriarchal pressures, and to enact instead more ethical and engaged forms of masculinity. So this was sort of the connection they made. Having a supportive family, really critical in working through these incidents. And we had a range of folks we were talking to. Again, most of our folks were sort of, folks from the States, again, kind of multiply privileged, but we had some international students who'd actually grown up in some pretty difficult situations, conflicts, et cetera, in their countries. And so that was part of, they were particularly articulate in this, with respect to this theme. Tough love as a, maybe this is part of what a supportive family means. Sometimes you just get the tough love from your family. One of our foreign students said, we're expected to go to school, work the hardest we could, and just kind of get through it, and no excuses. Responsibility and obligation has to do with taking care of the family, following, even in the face of challenge and struggle, meeting one's obligations, meeting one's responsibilities was key to folks. And then, again, this may be more of a summary than a separate theme, but a sense of moving forward, not backward, learning and growing from the challenges. There was a sense that it struck us that many of the folks we talked to who really faced these challenges and struggles were kind of wise beyond their years. They acknowledged the struggles and the traumas and the impact of them, and the importance of moving forward. So here's a little bit longer quote. "I had to get myself over the hump of it's okay to ask for help," says one of our subjects. "I don't know if that was stemming from my personality or what I believed to be a man at the time, but it was definitely something interesting. I think I've grown from the experience and can deal with personal strife better now." So our fourth theme, critique and resistance. And this is a theme that's particularly interesting to me. And just a quick sort of example, one of the young men who I started working with early on in my time in this sort of project, Eric Barthold, who's really taken this work after he's graduated, and he's sort of doing this kind of healthy masculinity work himself in really interesting ways. But he talked about for him, what was liberating was, in the class that I teach on boys and young men's development, we do the exercise called the man box, which some of you may know. It's a sort of a standard exercise around identifying, again, sort of traditional stereotypic messages about being a good man that typically are the tough, strong, hyper-masculine messages, and then the sense that there are other ways to be. And so for Eric, that was just sort of, he talks about that as like just so liberating, because it helped him begin to understand some of the things that he had been feeling growing up and the pressures, and put a name to the pressures and begin to give him a language to critique the social structure he had grown up in. And then that sort of liberated him to do sort of enormously good work. So the sense of a kind of critique and resistance to, again, those patriarchal messages liberated him to a new way of self-understanding. And virtually all the men we talked to, and again, probably no surprise as a function of who they were and how they were identified, the opportunities to critique and understand male privilege, to resist the norms and values that are, so pervasive, was really important to them. And some of the things that contributed to those opportunities were, strong women in their lives, being raised by a single mom, having girls who were friends, just really taking seriously the perspective of the girls and women in their lives. One of the guys we talked to says, even from a young age, I hung out with girls, and I learned that you can be around girls and they can be your friend. They don't have to be these sexual objects so foreign and mysterious. So that separation from sexual objects into real people was important. Athletics and sports, interestingly enough, also provided a context for exposure to non-masculine roles for some of the folks we talked to, and also being an athlete. And again, this is where the privilege plays in, sort of the privilege that comes to many men for being athletes, also gave them sort of permission to be resistors, if you will. So one of our informants says, my athleticism gave me a way to avoid conformity. That was really important to him. The connection between athletics and athletic women, in many cases, at least in some significant cases, older sisters who were really, terrific athletes, and sort of seeing that in their athletic success in the context of growing up as a younger brother was really important to a number of the folks we talked to. Accepting environments, being in contexts where the pressures to enact conventional limited forms of masculinity were mitigated was important. And also a sense of being an outsider, and an outsider status because of immigration or other causes was important to the number of the folks we talked to. One of the folks we talked to was being the only student of color in his school. Again, several of the international students talked about their feelings of being an outsider as they came to the States for the first time. So, opportunities for critique and resistance. And then finally, sort of opportunities to engage in activism and what might be called civic empowerment, civic engagement, characterized a lot of the folks we talked to. And certainly this is connected to critique and resistance. opportunities that for critique and resistance often led to opportunities to engage in action and civic work, whether it's small groups or on the campus or in the community or broader. And for some, this seemed to take a more sort of implicit form. One of the guys, John Kalin, who has also sort of taken this work on after graduation and doing healthy masculinity work as a career, if you will, talked about subliminal resistance. And as he was growing up, he said, at first I didn't even recognize I was doing it, but I was, he did a lot of his activism within the context of the basketball team and being a basketball player and a coach, et cetera. So it doesn't have to be like storming the barricades, and it can be a very subtle forms of resistance that and activism and engagement that can be very powerful. And but there are other times when an explicit forms of activism is really important, and many of our informants are self-described activists. They're members of activist groups. They work hard on issues of sexual violence prevention, challenging intersections among racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, on campus and beyond. And they approach this with an attitude of, this can happen here. And one of our folks we talked to says if adjusting the way we think about things is necessary to see that equality, to achieve that equality, then I'm willing to put in the work with 100, and he's talking about black students on racism to help change the perception of black men being thugs and lazy, et cetera. So being activists, having that opportunity was really important to the number of the folks we talked to. So those are the 5 themes, and I want to raise just a caveat here at the moment, and then finish with some thoughts about education broadly. So this is a quote from one of my other research assistants who this is an email exchange we've been having this spring. So, she's worried that, I don't know if it's, I guess walking the talk is the right, I'm trying to figure, is it talking the talk, walking the walk, whatever, but anyway, she's worried that, these guys that sound good in our interviews, and she knows some of them, are in fact, when they're actually out in the student culture, are not, in some cases, not just, they're misogynistic, they're emotionally manipulative, et cetera. So we're trying to really think this through and what it means. And it's certainly true that the kind of good-bad binary is not helpful or not accurate, right? It's not that there are just good men who are always good and bad, so there seems to be there certainly is a spectrum maybe, or a continuum. Thinking about this, as I said, as a journey, I think is a way to perhaps get at this. So we're still thinking this, through, and I'd welcome any thoughts you all have about this. But it's certainly, I think, true that the folks we've talked to are on this journey towards really this sense of being ethical and engaged men. But again, I think the pressures to be, particularly at that age, in college age, to conform to the traditional stereotypes and traditional assumptions of guyland, if you will, to follow those rules, to participate in the culture of entitlement, the culture of protection, the culture of silence, to sort of fall into that are just also really, really significant. So it's this work is really hard, and I think we have to acknowledge that, but also to not sort of to look at this honestly and to not just assume that we're just talking to all these wonderful folks who are good in all ways. So, I've been hard on Kimmel, but he's certainly, his aim here is to send him in this work on Guyland and elsewhere is to really, he has a sense of how things could be different, and the importance of being courageous, to doing the right thing. And I guess I would, this quote makes it sound like, this is a sort of individual choices that men make, and I think that's part of it, certainly. But I think we also have to think about the culture and changing the culture of Guyland and how we do that, and draw insights from folks who do that kind of work. So I've myself have been influenced in significant ways by kind of sociocultural psychology and that work. So that's one place to look, perhaps, to think about some of the implications. And one way to think about this work is thinking about what would it take, or what does a pedagogy of the privileged look like? And sort of these three steps I explored in a paper some years ago, trying to think about what a Freire-informed, kind of sociocultural informed model might look like for engaging in this kind of pedagogy of the privileged. That I think, these are pretty abstract descriptions of the process of both, unveiling the world of privileges, rejecting those myths, stereotypes, rules that support it, and then kind of replacing with new myths and images and cultural tools and mediational means and ways of being differently. So I think that's one of the things that is helpful to think about. Diane Goodman's work on educating people from privileged group, Katie Swalwell's book on educating activist allies, which also is kind of socioculturally informed. Those are really useful resources. And, it's interesting. There's a lot of work out there these days on youth activism among marginalized youth, but thinking about what, again, youth activism looks like from the standpoint of privileged youth, but on behalf of a project that is, challenging the status quo, I think is interesting way to think about what's happening with a lot of the folks that we've been talking to, and how to provide those opportunities more fully. So, interestingly enough, Helen talked about Levin Wenger's work yesterday, and their notion of communities of practice is also one of the ideas that I've been exploring, thinking about the sense of the domain of the sort of knowledge, skills, values that are part of an ethical engaged forms of masculinity. Then, how do you scaffold or provide apprenticeship opportunities for boys and young men in the context of relationships? And again, we've certainly heard that in our study, in our data, as critical to boys and young men. And then really thinking about what a community of practice looks like. And I just wanted to end with three quick examples of what we've been doing at Colby. MAV is a group called Mules Against Violence, and that's a group of male athletes that formed several years ago to really take on the challenge of sort of peer-led challenge of working with male athletes, doing training around sexual violence prevention and norms of masculinity, and really, taking on this opportunity to do this work. And my role as the sort of faculty advisor to that group was certainly, I think, to provide opportunities to scaffold that process and to be in relationship with them, and to provide opportunities for critique and suggestions about empowerment, et cetera. So that's one place. MVP is Mentors in Violence Prevention, which is a little more formal gender violence prevention project that we've also been working with at Colby to train peer educators, and we've brought professional trainers in, and their work is certainly, so they're working with our students on this project, and their work is certainly, I mean, that work is to create a community of practice who can sort of then move out into our community at our campus and do this work. As I mentioned, I teach this course on Boys to Men, and we talk about a lot of these things. We also, students work with local boys groups in middle schools, and so that's an opportunity for, so I serve a kind of scaffolding role for my students, and then they serve a scaffolding role for middle school boys. It's both men and women involved in the course, and so that, I think, is an interesting opportunity that we're going to look more closely at in this project. And finally, we've done what's called a men's summit at Colby, and this is a picture of the first one, which is an opportunity for male faculty, staff, administrators, and students who identify as male to get together for an afternoon, a meal and conversation in a safe context to have these conversations about the community more broadly. And so it's an attempt to connect back to the role model notion, men on campus to young men, and to have the conversation. And we've had, that's happened 3 years in a row, and just talked to a student who they're thinking about doing it this year, and I'm just going to be sad to miss it. But so it's become a little bit of an institutionalized effort at Colby that has potential in, again, this sense of providing an opportunity for scaffolding and apprenticeship in a certain sense, and intergenerational connection, and that intergenerational connection, Lynn's talked a lot about that, I think, is another piece of this that we want to fill out as we move ahead. So that's where I end, with more work to do, and happy to turn things over to Reed and then see where we go. So thanks.
Thank you.
Oh yeah. All right. Great. Well, thank you very much, Mark. Is it really loud, or is that just sounds like to me? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mark. I really enjoyed your presentation. It was thought-provoking, and definitely, given a number of different issues happening right now, it's very timely as well, both with our political climate and also with the real crisis of sexual assault on college campuses as well. So I think it's very well appreciated. You highlighted both the challenges of masculinity for young men today, that what you called the bad news. Both the bad news and then also what you called the good news. And in doing so, you emphasized.
How about I give you this? So this.
The best thing is we're recording it.
Okay.
Turn over the power thing there.
All right, thank you. So you highlighted the importance of multiple masculinities, both the patriarchal masculinity and more productive masculinities. And in doing so, you're promoting the existence of a plurality of masculinities, and that to me seems like it's actually a form of resistance in itself, because it's challenging the traditional notion of there only being one way to be a man, which then helps create a space for new alternative understandings of manhood that are more caring, open, compassionate, and activist to grow. And then in your actual empirical research, I really appreciated the strengths-based approach that you took, and the way that you contextualized the work that you're doing, being at for a specific population of privileged, or at least mainly multiply privileged men on a college campus. And of the 5 themes that you highlighted, a couple really stood out to me. The first was the importance of long and meaningful relationships. And it really stood out to me that most of these were relationships with women. You mentioned some positive relationships with men, but it really struck me that most of them were with women. And on one hand, it seems natural that there's a certain perspectives that only women can give to men, but then on the other hand, it seems like it points to a real hole that men are leaving for their peers and not being role models. But one of the questions that raised for me is what kinds of roles can men play in the healthy development of men, and then what roles is it actually very important for women to play, and if those are there's clear roles on either side, or if there are certain just how those roles are distinguished. I was also struck by the importance of critique that you raised, and it seems especially for educators like all of us here that's particularly important. And with the quote that you raised at the end of walking the talk, it seems like this idea of critique is especially important. Being able to not just think that one has arrived at a healthy idea of masculinity, but continually critiquing. So I mainly wanted to focus on just 3 sets of questions that your talk raised for me, and then we can turn it over so everyone else can raise their own questions. The questions relate to both your research methods, generalizability of your findings, and then the third area is the application of of your findings to practice. So in terms of your methodology, you used the kind of exemplar method and retrospective accounts of individuals' development. And I'm very drawn to that method in a lot of ways. I've really liked how it's been used by Ann Colby and William Damon and work on morality and purpose. But it also raises some questions for me. And one, again, goes back to this kind of the quote about walking the talk, is how you thought about defining your sample of who is an exemplary man, and how can you know, especially one of the things that's struck me being here at HGSE, which I think is generally it's a very well-intentioned place, but finding that some of my female colleagues don't actually find it as inviting as I do. And there's a lot of different causes of that, but I think you definitely can't assume the positive masculinity that one would like to. And then also, this is the kind of PhD student in me. I'm interested in how you analyze your data retrospectively when it's harder to make causal claims about what are the most factors for development. And then the generalizability of your findings. Again, like I mentioned, I think you did a great job of contextualizing the kind of population that you're studying. And I'd be interested, this is probably more speculative, which of your findings do you think might apply to other populations? And specifically, I was interested in, with all the attention that's been put on the working class white male that has really lost, or at least perceives to have lost, a lot of opportunity, if you think the findings that you found would apply, or what would apply and what wouldn't apply. And then I also am interested to know more about what you think in your findings applies very specifically to development of masculine identities versus just general human development. You spoke a little bit about that you've seen some distinctions, but I'd love to know more about what you think might be unique. And then finally, as an educator, you mentioned that you've been thinking about how this will apply to practice, and that was actually some of the inspiration for this work. But I'd just be interested to know more about how you've thought about applying this specifically in your courses and to the Colby or any college campus in general, but then also what kind of structural issues that these findings point out. And again, going back to this kind of issue of mentorship or of role models, if there's the need for more potentially ways to support role models of healthy males or deep relationships with females at an early age across society. And then a final question was, in the book chapter that you shared with me, you mentioned that the MAV group, which is now Mules Against Violence, started as a male-only group. And I was interested in if you think there's specific, how that group changed as it switched from a male-only group to a mixed gender group, and then again, if you think it's kind of serves a different purpose or ultimately serves the same purpose in both formations. So those are my questions. I think probably doesn't make sense to go into all of them, but hopefully it can inspire the discussion for everyone.
Thank you, Rita. Do you want to have a quick response, Mark, or about the discussion?
Well, I don't know. What's
So I think a couple of points we want to read, and then we'll open it up, and people can start sharing
Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah, no, those are really, really useful. Golly. I don't know, maybe just thinking about the last one, which, connects. So the question about male only versus, kind of co-ed conversations. I just had this conversation yesterday about this men's summit, because so they're thinking this year. Maybe this is an answer, but they're thinking about calling it a masculinity summit, not a men's summit, because they really want to bring in women into the conversation, because that's, and so Maddie is quoted as an example of the kind of conversation that happens at a small college. There are 1,800 students at Colby. It's not as small as it could be, but it's pretty small. So there's a lot of conversation about the social culture, the hookup culture, all of that's in play, and it's, it is a very heteronormative place, but it's not exclusively that. So there's just all of that's going on. So, so we were trying to figure out what would be different if this was a conversation about masculinity that opened to everybody, or a conversation about, a men's summit versus a masculinity summit. And what we've found is that, when the conversations are open broadly, men feel pretty threatened sometimes, and so they don't show up. And so, when we have our men's summit and we have 100 men there, and the women activists on campus say, "Wow, why can't we have that turnout on all of our, events?" And it's a problem, right? I mean, it's a problem because there should be. Why is it so threatening? So I guess the answer is trying to figure out how to make these conversations, safe for everybody. And I think certainly there's many of the guys that we talk to wouldn't be threatened, and so they are the ones who can participate in these conversations and not feel anxious or threatened by them. But sort of thinking about how to make that possible is one of our ongoing challenges. And so when MAV, Male Athletes Against Violence, became Mules Against Violence, again, it was sort of in response to that impulse to say, this is a conversation that there are a lot of women who want to be involved in. And it changed the work of the group somewhat, but there's also been a core of folks that I've worked with that have continued to really see the value of the sort of male-only conversation. And for us at Colby, again, this is our culture, that's played out largely in the context of male sports teams. So that's a context where it makes sense to have, all right, so we're going to have these conversations with the men's basketball team and the football team and the women's lacrosse, so across that, they turn out to be really different conversations. The women have certain things they want to talk about than others. So, we're still kind of sorting that out. So, I know that's one answer to a lot of really good questions. So yeah.
Just say that,
Yep.
if you want to ask a question, please say who you are, and here's a microphone which Sanjay is going to wave around, because we are recording and we'd like to capture your comments. So who'd like to start with the question?
Phil, on you.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi.
Whoa. Hold it way over here. Thank you so much for your talk. It was great, and I loved how you really mapped out your research, and also for including students in your research. I think that's awesome. My name is Rachel. I'm a HGSE alum, and I've been really involved on campus here with Richard Weisboard and planning a lot of the same types of events and things that similar to the Men's Summit and different things around sexual assault and healthy relationship programming. My question for you is, in your research, did you ever explicitly ask about about the males, their histories of encountering sexual violence, or whether they had ever committed sexual violence or aggression themselves. And kind of with that, maybe at a lesser form, but equally problematic, did you talk to them about the problematic language culture? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, those are really good questions. So I would say, so this particular study wasn't designed to ask those kinds of specific questions. We've been thinking about doing that. We may actually, in collaboration with our colleague Sharon Lamb, who Helen mentioned, we may sort of do something about that. But so we didn't. It often came up though. I mean, so it came up spontaneously for these guys. And again, many of them were involved in this work, and so we're already sort of thinking about these issues. And for a number of them, actually being, so one of, a formative experience for many of them, and this I think this gets sort of coded in under the experience of challenge, and that may not be right, is actually hearing from friends, often friends who identify as women, about their experiences of sexual assault. So that hearing that story, or in one case actually witnessing it in high school, so having an encounter with that is really powerful as a sort of challenging sort of moment of crisis almost for many of these guys. And in fact, the formation of the MAV group came about in part as a result of sort of public sharing of a senior thesis that was done about 4 years ago about incidents of sexual assault on campus. And so it was like these guys said, wow, is that, for those who hadn't heard about it, wow, is that really happening here? And it was like, we got to do something. So the answer is we haven't asked explicitly about that, but many of them raise that. They also, the issue of language on campus and how it's used, and the misogynistic language and the way in which that plays out is really something that a lot of folks notice. It's a conversation among men in these groups, Men's Summit, et cetera. But we haven't asked everyone explicitly about sort of their use. But it's hard. I mean, it's really a hard thing, and that's an example of a place where, Kimball talks about courage, and there's no doubt that in this context, many of the guys that I've worked with, they will call their friends out, and they recognize the cost of doing that, and it's, oh, there's Eric again, well, we kind of shut up because Eric's here, and, that's hard. It's really hard. But, they're willing to, in that case, certainly willing to, pay the price. But those are great questions. And there's a lot of work, there's Title IX requirements to do campus climate surveys, and you probably know that. But so there's a lot of interest in trying to get a bigger picture of these kinds of things on campus and how they break down by gender. So they're really great questions. We were casting a broader net at the start, but we need to go back.
Hi, my name is Justine Finn, and I'm sorry I joined the conversation a little late, so I hope my question wasn't answered earlier. If it was, let me know, and my friend Rachel will help me get caught up. I am a recent alum of HGSE, and I'm the founder and director of an organization called Relationshift that works with middle and high schools and middle and high school educators on preventing relationship and sexual violence and promoting healthy, gender identities, etc. So my question is, you work in the education department, you teach classes on education. How do you think we can help K through 12 educators disrupt behaviors associated with toxic masculinity? Here at the Ed School, there's 700 graduate students, and there's very few opportunities to come to conversations like this, to help us have a lens of gender. And I think there's a lot of behaviors in the classroom that are harmful for students, harmful for the culture, that are seen as the performance of regular heteronormative masculinity.
Sure, yeah.
So what can we do, either at ed schools or in colleges or in K through 12?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Yeah, so when this is a slightly different project, but as I mentioned this interest in boys and relationships in school. So we did focus groups with colleagues of mine in a group called Maine Boys Network. So we did focus groups with boys in schools across Maine, and one of the things we heard from boys was a sense, and from teachers. So we talked to teachers. There's a sense that, well, boys will be boys, and that's who they are, and not to worry about it. Our colleague Nan Stein, who works at Wellesley Centers for Women, and Lynn maybe can join in on this answer, but she's been, well, Lynn too, have been on writing about the way in which the bully prevention language actually sort of whitewashes over what's really sexual assault, and that piece. So the question about how to get teachers in, I think you just have to, school leaders, et cetera, just have to say this is important. We need to have a conversation about this. There are lots of ways into the conversation, what from the fairly recent, films, the misrepresentation film. There's a film called The Mask You Live In, which is about boys. That can be a place to start the conversation. Again, that's kind of the bad news piece of it. So I appreciate your question, and I think it really is a real one. And when you talk to kids, boys and girls about this, they notice a lot of things, and sort of getting from that point to sort of letting the teachers really hear that stuff is part of the work. I think that matters. So I don't know if I'm putting you on the spot about.
I think the impulse to go to give kids an opportunity to talk about how this impacts their lives, whether it's, people who do youth participatory action research or that kind of work where youth can really have an opportunity to sort of research what's happening in the school and feed it back to adults is really powerful, I think, for teachers. It's one way to go.
Yeah. So one real quick example, I mentioned these boys groups that my students do. So a couple of years ago, two of my students worked with 6th grade boys at the Waterville Middle School, and this actually ties to both of these questions now that I think about it. So this group of 6th grade boys, and these groups are not easy to wrangle, but they got to a point and they have about 10 sessions over the course of the semester. They really were interested in taking on the question of, language in school, right? And they noticed and this was mostly the homophobic language, that's so gay and all that stuff. And so they decided they signed a pledge amongst themselves that they weren't going to do this anymore. And they decided they wanted to get the whole class to sign this pledge, a class of about 100. So they did a presentation at the lunchroom and had people sign. And, so that's an opportunity for kind of youth to engage, activism, participatory process. I think we've also worked with a local Gay Straight Trans Alliance in a high school, and so I think youth activism is, opportunities for that. And the problem is that, that can often turn into challenges to the structure of the school or the way things happen. So you have to be willing to put up with that, but that's a pretty powerful resource. So
I'd like to say something.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Mark and Reid, for very provocative questions and discussions. I do have, I think, the same questions that Reid asks.
Yeah.
Not so much generalizability, but we are seeing, we call it working class white male problem, but it's not only that.
Yeah.
There is a vast range of people in this country, what do you call it, people, swathes of society, where either the issues of gender improvement, I wasn't going to call it feminism, but let's say just generally the transformation of gender just hasn't really hit for a variety, for either sex, actually. And I think that's something we need to pay attention to. I mean, going back to the question of why could women possibly vote for Trump, given what an absolutely awful chauvinist and sexist he is. Well, they did. And the question is, there's obviously something amiss there in the culture that we had taken for granted had changed. I think that, I think what you're doing is fantastic. And what's happening in liberal environments is fantastic. But how do we get out of our liberal bubble? And how do we challenge the culture, which we thought had gone such a long way on issues around gender, and clearly even in a place like Colby College has not gone as far as we'd like it to.
No, I think that's a really important question, and that's back to Reed's question about, and I absolutely, this is a liberal academic bubble of a small, context where we're working, and so surrounded in Maine and elsewhere by really different. So I think it's really, really a good question, and I think for me, one of the factors that's playing in is this sense of anxiety about precariousness, about economics and social place, and it's certainly related to masculinity. And I think figuring out a way to reduce that in some way is part of the answer. And maybe there's no way to do that without good jobs and all of that. But I think certainly that's one of the things that cuts through our data. And again, this is no doubt in part a function of privilege, but it does distinguish the guys that we're talking to from other guys on campus who are, they're not, they are not anxious about proving their manhood at every turn. They're okay with being themselves and, not having to, live up to that and prove that. And so that anxiety is reduced for them. And I think that matters. But how to extend that more broadly is a really great question. So that more work to be done on that for sure. Yeah.
Wait for the microphone, Robin.
I can speak loudly as
No,
well.
it's a question of picking up the recordings.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that. For some reason, hold it distance, otherwise it bounds.
Okay.
Yeah.
How's that? Oh, terrible. Okay. I'll ask a question that might be more for the, I don't know, the people who do a lot of work with campus sexual assault and prevention and things like that. But since you definitely have insight into that issue, I'll ask it of you as well. Which is, I'm wondering, without sounding too cynical, I'm wondering if you have any reason to sort of be pointed to the direction that regardless of this good work, regardless of whether you're in a liberal setting or a conservative setting, the issue may persist and not, in fact, be reduced by this. I'll use a phrase that Rick uses in class, which is sort of the moral literacy of the situation as opposed to the action level. Sort of in line with that slide you put up that said walk the talk or whatever. What would we say if after all these efforts, the number of campus sexual assaults stayed high, even among the most literate, the populations who are speaking about it in a very self-reflective way? I'm just curious if you have any reason to think it's going in a positive direction or otherwise.
So the moral literacy, so I don't know that phrase from Rick.
Basically, similar to what you were saying, they're very well versed.
They can talk a good
Absolutely, they can
talk.
speak with their female friends and feel an alliance and sort of say the right things. But I'm really curious if that actually predicts that they'll do the right thing, and if we have any. It seems like there's reason to think that they will, but that's all. That might not have been a clear question. But
no, it's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I guess I think it does. I mean, I think it's important. It's not the whole story, and I guess I think that again. I guess I go back to this idea that it's. It has to be this sort of notion of a community of practice or something, some sense of a kind of a collective kind of holding each other account in a certain way. I mean, that's what we're trying to. So that's changing the culture at Colby, changing resisting Guyland. All of that is trying to change the culture so that the male peer culture holds each other account in a certain way. And I think part of that is having the language to talk about what's right and fair. But it's not the only thing. There has to be a kind of commitment to a collective holding accountable, a kind of collective change of practice, and I've seen it happen on sports teams and et cetera. I've certainly seen it happen, and it involves leadership. It involves a kind of loyalty to each other, kind of a commitment to doing the right thing. But it's again the pressures to be elsewise are really hard. So I'm an optimist. So I think working collectively is the right way to go. Sort of building on these opportunities for critique and action matter. But the question of is it going to change? I mean, what's happening now, of course, is the data, incidents of report are going up because of kind of consciousness raising that's happening on campus. That's happening at Colby. So hopefully it's going to level off and start going down. But I've been reading recently, just really quickly, Lisa Wade's, who's a sociologist in California, new book on called American Hookup. And that is a remarkable book. If you're interested in this, hookup culture, which ties into this, it's a really, really interesting book that's, from all angles. So I'm a big fan of hers. And if you're doing this work in campus sexual assault and thinking about that, I definitely recommend that. American Hookup by Lisa Wade. So.
Thanks.
So we're about out of time. Oh.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I study campus sexual assault, and I agree with the fact that it doesn't have to be a collective effort, but I think we have an illusion that we have a zero tolerance policy for this type of violence, and it's not there yet. And I think the increase of report on campuses is due to consciousness raising, but it's also largely due to increased federal accountability and reporting mechanisms for survivors. So I think we have to look at it from those perspectives. And I've read Lisa's book as well. It is definitely an important text for this conversation, taking it through the lens that painting a hookup culture can be problematic depending on how you're defining that hookup culture. So I agree with her in some ways, but also I think everyone should read it and then have their own opinion. But I think some of the ways that she outlines the party scene are not representative of all college student experiences and largely speak to a very small, similar to yours, you can only speak to the students that you spoke with. But I think it's problematic to paint the picture of hookup culture when scholars like Rick, for instance, would say that hookup culture is not what we think it is. So I think it's important to keep all of that, it's these terms and the students that we're talking with. And I also personally believe that sexual assault does not look the same on every campus, and sexual assault prevention, therefore, cannot look the same on every campus.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks. No, fair enough. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark,
Yeah.
and Reed, and George.
Yeah.